The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the podcast belong solely to the hosts and not the host's past, present, or future employers. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's Brian for Breaking Down Security. This week, part 2 of our discussion with Fred Jennings on vulnerability equity, vulnerability disclosure process, and disclosure of ODAs is going to continue. This week, we get into, I wouldn't say the more higher level discussion, but there's definitely some discussion with management on how to establish these systems. They're not easy. They're not undertaken lightly. A lot of organizations, because they're getting bigger, or they're not necessarily maturing. They're just getting bigger. They're starting to talk with third parties about integrating things. Everyone is asking in terms of vendor management or supply chain security. What are you doing for vulnerability disclosure process? Do you have a bug bounty, etc.? And, there's a lot of times there's a knee-jerk reaction of, oh, well, we'll just, hire a bug crowd or something and make that happen. And there's actually a lot of nuance there, a lot of things that need to happen before you can just say, yeah, we have a bug bounty program. There's a lot of ways to do it wrong. More often than not, it's not done correctly, and that will often lead you into issues with the press or with reputational damage or what have you, depending on how you choose to handle your response to people sending you vulnerabilities. I think we talk about that a little bit. Also, we start talking about, in terms of supply chain security, what happens if somebody finds a vulnerability and you are, it's on code that you don't necessarily own. So is that within your bug bounty? How do you handle that? If I think we bring up Samsung and Google as an example of Samsung using a custom version of Android, for instance. And if we find a version or an issue in Samsung, what happens there? What should be the response? And obviously, I don't have visibility into either how Samsung or Google do things, but it was just an interesting question that we kind of, played back and forth with and talked a little bit about. So hope you find those things valuable. Maybe your company does software management or software development, and you've got third parties that are, giving you firmware code or something like that. And you, that's a definite risk. How do you handle the response to that? So we talked a little bit about that. All right. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and let us get it started on this. Hope you have a great week. And so one thing that I have noticed, at least in my limited experience with vulnerability management, is, management, sees this buzzword RSA, or they hear something on the news about, vulnerability disclosure programs, and they'll come to their IT or security departments and say, yeah, we should set up one of those.
Yep.
And then you counter, you being the CISO or whatever, and okay, great, we need $1 million of budget for bug bounties. And then they balk on that.
Right.
How do we, being we not upper management or upper middle management, how do we communicate that if somebody decides, hey, we should have one of these things, without actually realizing there's a cost involved with that?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one, and this also gets into let's see, where's the best way to come at this one from? I think with any sort of initiative around security, that's a hard one, because at the end of the day, if you're talking to upper management or the board, security, much like legal, is primarily a cost item.
Right.
People are typically not, with relatively few exceptions, you've maybe got a reputational boost by being a company with a reputation for really good security, but
right.
In a market full of a lot of different actors offering the similar service, that's rarely going to be the thing that swings people.
Right.
So until something goes horribly wrong and there's a million spotlights on the company saying, "Look at how terrible this breach was," here's everyone's credit card data everywhere. Now people are fleeing, market values tanking.
Right.
It's a cost item until it becomes extremely necessary, and I think this is one of those areas where legal and security at companies have a lot of sort of cultural alignment in terms of how to navigate those things.
Right.
I think proactively, if it's sort of the start of that conversation with upper management saying, hey, we should really do this. I think it's an educational task in the first instance there to say, well, sure we can, but here is what it's going to cost to run that program. Here's what we need for reward payouts to be, competitive with other companies with similar security postures or, sort of similar market values. Here's the amount of sort of just work hours it's going to take.
Right.
Laying out sort of the reality of how much it costs and laying out the reality of the benefits. There are certainly companies for which, bug bounty is just not going to be the best solution.
Right.
So I think there's sort of that judgment call of, is this, sure, it's a hot topic, but is this really what is the right place to put, security resources?
Right. Right. And the one thing is there's costs, not just the costs of setting up like a budget to be able to pay for the bounties, but it's like, if you're a security person and you're involved anywhere in the agile pipeline, let's say you release software, for instance, or you've got a hardware device or something, you could pretty much figure out how much money you're going to pay out per year in bug bounties by looking at the backlog of your, the stuff that didn't make it in the latest release. And you could go, well, okay, here's 15 buffer overflows. And here's something that could potentially be an RCE. If a security researcher who has inestimable amounts of time looking at your product found these vulnerabilities, what is this going to cost us? If they found this RCE, this is, X. So, if you have management who comes to you and goes, oh, well, we need this bug bounty program because we need to align with, this project, or, this third party wants to integrate with us or partner with us, but, they need these things from us to do so. You can say, okay, great. These 15 vulnerabilities that still exist in the thing we just shipped, is going to cost us $250,000. So we're going to need $500,000 because that's what the security researchers are going to look for that.
Yep, exactly. And I think that's another good example where, like, if you've got security tech debt that you're already aware of, a bug bounty program may not be as helpful as you think, because it's, it may just rediscover things you already know. It's going to take time and resources away from the people who might otherwise be going to solve those already known issues. And like that is an extremely case-by-case judgment call of, where do you put those resources? I think the other thing that's easy to forget with a company who's just sort of looking to get a bug bounty or vulnerability disclosure program off the ground is, sure, it's all well and good to get the policy up there, post it, have that sort of standing there, but you need people internally who will monitor those reports, review those reports, determine, if you do have sort of a nuanced payout for your bounty, people need to be able to determine sort of, this one's real and get this level of payout. This one's, something that we patched and fixed a year ago. Why are they even talking about it? And this one is, practically a spam email through the bug bounty program about, something that they, tweaked in the, view source editor that doesn't actually affect anyone.
State of Missouri, hello.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just a one-time cost of staying a program, and it's not just an occasional cost of paying out rewards. It's a ongoing cost and also like staffing cost of making sure you've got people who actually actively run the program, make the kind of complicated case-by-case calls on that program, and sort of keep things moving on fixing it.
Yep. Yeah. Your bug bounty is actually going to pay, like, you're going to end up paying 3-4 times what you may pay 50,000 to that security researcher, but then, there's the tech debt incurred, there's the press debt incurred, there's the legal debt and risk debt incurred. So, you may end up paying $250,000 for a simple cross-site scripting if depending on the vulnerabilities there. Yeah.
Yep. And I think at that early stage, that sort of that undervaluing of the program cost, I think, is what kind of ultimately puts a lot of companies in this unfortunate position of, really only being budgeted to offer, the t-shirt or the company branded mug to the critical security vulnerability. And, that's the sort of stuff that makes your outside researchers say, oh, well, I'm going to go, spend my efforts elsewhere, whether that's dropping your vulns on the dark web or just going to someone else on the, bug crowd list of paid programs. Either way, now you've got a bug bounty program and all that cost and none of the benefits.
Yep. Yeah, it would almost be cheaper for you to run a 1099 on the security researcher and hire them as a contractor, and then
precisely
hire them on that way. Yeah,
yeah, and like I think that's where it becomes a difficult conversation. Is like at the end of the day, for the budget that you're likely to get, it's only sometimes going to be the right call to spend that on third party bug bounty programs.
Right. Yeah. So I have been, I work at a company that does a lot of work with integrators, bringing in third-party code. We've had Dr. Alan Friedman on talking about, SBOMs and stuff, making sure that third-party code and modules come in. So at GitHub, you worked a lot. I don't know if you are privy to all this, but you worked with a lot of third parties potentially because you integrate their code, you use their modules or what have you.
Yep.
How difficult is it if you're in that position to have a bug bounty and let's say the vulnerability that's introduced is not even code that you own, or is you're a reseller, or let's say you're like Samsung and you have your own flavored Android and the vulnerabilities in Android. So security researchers can disclose that to Google as an Android bug, but then they can also double dip to Samsung and say, hey, I found this vulnerability in your crap. You need to fix this. What does Samsung do for a bug bounty if it affects Android code as well? I mean, is that just a sad fact of life that they're going to have to pay out as well?
This is an interesting question in both parts, because I think they're slightly different. Whether you're talking about sort of an upstream service, like in like the Android to Samsung example, or a downstream vendor. The question of when and whether to include third-party services within the scope of one's bug bounty is another complicated one. I think the stance that we took at GitHub was, and I'm going off memory here, so if I've completely misquoted my own bounty program, apologies. But I think usually the stance that was taken was, third-party services are not necessarily in scope for the bug bounty. That does not violate the safe harbor section necessarily, unless we think you're like intentionally targeting this third party. But that as far as payouts, sort of took the position that if it's with a third party thing that we use, really your bounty concern is with them, and you need to go to them for that bounty, or you can go to us, but the result is going to be we either put you in touch with that third party through their program, or insulate you, and like it would not result in a payout to the researcher necessarily if it was a third party service, just because it's no longer a company vulnerability. It's a sort of internalized vulnerability from this third party. I think that's trickier in the Samsung situation, and I'm trying to think if I have any firsthand dealing with that type of situation. I think the the Samsung to Android one is also an interesting one, because I don't have any sense of whether there are lines of communication between the two.
Right.
If I'm Samsung Security and I, on the Android team, and have some contacts at Google who I can sort of quietly go to and say, hey, we got this interesting vulnerability report on this kind of topic. Are you already aware of this? And they say, oh yeah, person with the same screen name told us about that last week. As long as we've drafted our policy cleverly, maybe what I go back and say is, hey, we're aware that there's already a fix in the works on this, and that you already reported it to, the actual root cause of the bug.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that's much. If you don't have that line of communication, I think that's a much harder question, and probably the sort of safer thing to do is, just evaluate that like any other report, and ideally have some permission in your policy that allows you to talk to this superior vendor service.
Right. And just to be fair for all the listeners, I don't know how Google and Samsung do things either. I don't, but I would assume that there is some kind of communication or discussion there, with regards to how things work. They probably have some kind of partnership to share any kind of vulnerabilities between one another, because they would have to have some kind of data sharing or information sharing there. So and it would just make sense. Now, of course, being big companies, there may be a lot of things that don't make sense there, but so I think so. I had a question down here, and I was just kind of thinking out loud. In a perfect world, what does a disclosure look like? And not to use the word responsible disclosure, because that's, in 2021, we're still using that term and nobody knows what the real answer to that is. And also same lines of what the hell a pen test versus a red team is. We're still having those kinds of ignorant arguments on Twitter. But in your opinion, from a legal point of view, what would a responsible disclosure look like in the best sense of the word, in the Platonic, not Platonic, but in Plato's ideal, way? What does that look like for you?
I think my cheeky response to that question is the follow-up question: ideal or best for who? If we're talking about best for the company, probably the one where the researcher does it for free and signs an NDA that says that they will go to the grave with every last detail of their vulnerability, tightly sealed. If we're talking about good for, if we're talking about sort of good for, I think if I take the question sort of as what sort of ideal and best for security generally, and the ability of people and companies to protect themselves from malicious actors with the same knowledge and information. If I think of what I'd look for in sort of a perfect disclosure policy, I think it would be something that if it has any sort of embargo at all, tailors that very carefully to the question of how long would it take to fix this and how many people would potentially be affected. I think it is, I think that question of, what does, I'll use the loaded term so someone can get angry about it at me on Twitter later. But what does sort of responsible disclosure looks like? I think that varies a lot depending on what's being disclosed. To use that example from before, if it's Widgets Inc. who's misconfigured their S2 bucket, that's not a global risk. That's a very company-specific risk. Maybe they've put sensitive data up there, and there are individuals who'd be affected, but it's also it's a quick and well-known fix. If we're talking a novel ODE in a Zen hypervisor that's used in thousands of systems worldwide, that's a very different situation. And I think like in those sort of broader impact situations, as far as how much havoc are you creating for the rest of the world, that has a very different answer depending on whether that is a vulnerability disclosed with, a shruggy emoji saying good luck, or a vulnerability disclosed with clear instructions on how to patch or mitigate the risk. So I think like the first aspect would be, if we're limiting security researcher speech, it should be done really only when there is a clear and substantiated need for that. not in a way that just allows places to sweep these disclosures under the rug. I think in order to kind of keep this sort of corner of the research industry working and flowing, I think that internal process to sort of accurately and appropriately value different types of disclosures is necessary. If you're offering any sort of pay at all, it's only really effective if you have the expertise to say, here's what this kind of bug is worth to us, and have the internal process and business support to get the budget for that.
Right.
I think that's absolutely key. And then sort of like we were talking before, I think if there is that kind of public interest embargo process, having like some mechanism for information sharing to concerned third parties is very helpful. One thing that remains difficult with bug bounty programs is that example you gave of, hey, you've reported it to us, but really the root of this vulnerability is in a vendor service or some other third party, where I may have the best bug bounty program policy ever written, and the security researchers might really like it. It might be extremely fair, but if this concerns a third party, that only my bug bounty program can't automatically bind that third party. That right. becomes sort of a trickier question of lines of communication and company relationships and circles of trust. And I think having some language in there to cover for those kind of cases where a third party needs to be involved in order to fix the problem, I think that's also pretty key to do carefully and do right.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing this with, and we talked last year. We had the folks who helped write some of the Ripple 20 stuff, where they're using IoT security, but they're using TCP stacks that are 30 years old from a company that may or may not exist anymore, and it's a systemic issue across environments. ICS and medical devices are also seeing this. So you got a disclosure of a vulnerability. Hey, your TCP stack will do blah if I send a malformed packet. And it's like, well, we can't fix that. And where we're using an old piece of software. It's almost getting to where when we're triaging for vulnerabilities in our environments, our technical debt, we should start assigning potentially a value to that. I mean, we do it with story points and stuff like that, like level of effort to fix, but we should say, hey, this is going to take us $40,000 to fix now, or it's going to cost us $80,000 in the open market when a security researcher comes to us. And in terms of prioritizing these issues for launch of devices or services or apps or what have you.
I think that's an excellent idea, and especially in sort of an embedded devices context, like you mentioned, where let's like post-release or post-sale updates are sometimes very difficult to push and very hard to make consistent. That's that's a perfect example of a area where that kind of forward-thinking valuation of the preventive measures you could take would be huge.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. So we have a little bit of time left here. One of the things and one of the reasons that this inspired these shows was Randery's discussion of why 0 days are essential to security. And they put a blog post out saying, we believe, we should be, finding this stuff. I don't know if they buy and sell O days. Whether they do or not right now is outside what I would consider the scope of this, but they do 0 day exploit, research and looking for things in various products. And somebody had mentioned on Twitter that, hey, are you using O days during pen testing? And somebody had, there was the debate of you shouldn't use O days during pen testing because, there's no defense against that. Or, is it just, you can't really find anything really wrong during the assessment and you need to, show up the company that you actually know what you're doing. From my point of view, I would say you shouldn't use something that people don't know they need a defense against, or I can see them using the O-days against existing defenses to see if that O-day would be blocked, maybe testing for that. But using an O-day and not having a way to mitigate that, it's like, oh well, we used an O-day, we popped you, and there's no real way to patch that, and we've seen that with things like, it seems a little on the irresponsible side. So I was just thinking from a legal point of view, how would a company who uses O-days for engagements or something like that, and I'm sure it does happen once in a while, but how can they, what is kind of legal footing there for them if they decided that was their milieu, that was what they wanted to do?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting legal question, because it kind of gets into, why did the company ask for a pen test in the first place? Right. And I think I like the point you made earlier about if you've got sort of an IDS or some other like defensive system set up, sure, it would be really interesting for a company's security posture to know whether that's sufficient to protect against some unknown O-day, as opposed to your sort of laundry list of known vulnerabilities.
Right.
From a legal perspective, a lot of the business demand for outside security testing is compliance driven. So if I'm looking to be able to say to company management, hey, like, just talk to the InfoSec team and we're good to go on the SOC 2 audit. Right. I don't think either security or legal or the business team would be terribly happy to, hear that the outside testing company gave us a fail because they found that something was not protected against an O-day. But right. I guess like it sort of gets into, are you trying to just improve your security posture, or you're doing this sort of as part of a larger, security or legal compliance need or certification need, where that may be just outside the usual professional scope of what that's looking for. Mm-hmm. I think it's also an interesting question, because I guess like the follow-up I would be curious to know is, like, in this situation where outside pen tester is burning an O-day on my right. company's audit,
right?
Are they then disclosing that O-day to us? Are right. they disclosing that publicly? Are they, if this is just, we're going to use it and tell you failed and give you no information about what we did or how,
right.
that seems a little more, it doesn't seem like quite as fair play as if, if you're going to use this thing, now it is also publicly disclosed and no longer an O-day.
Yeah. Would also, like, if I am a company and somebody does use something in their war chest of, O-day related items, can I then go to Snort or Cisco and say, hey, I just had this pen test and they used this on me. Do you right. know about this?
Yep.
You need to fix this now, because, we have X, we have this vulnerability, and and now Cisco's been alerted to it. And then, right. I can definitely see a press brouhaha come on over this.
I can see a press brouhaha. And depending on the terms of the contract with this outside security provider, I could see a legal brouhaha over it too. If I've signed some NDA with my outside security consultant saying, I will not disclose the detailed process and methods used in, this penetration test, and I then run to Cisco with information. Let's say like I go give Cisco the logs of what it looked like when this piece, when this O-day was used.
Right.
If someone came to me as company legal and said, hey, here's what just happened and here's who we told about it, that's a tough call. I think right. there's this strong sort of public interest in security disclosure of novel vulnerabilities, and at the same time that that may or may not outweigh the enforceability of that NDA. So
right. And depending on who you use for things like monitoring, detection,
Yep.
not to toot horns, but Miss Berlin works for a company that excels in trying to find things exactly like this. And if
Right.
they're monitoring your logs for you, and you're like, hey, we got a pen test coming up, and Blue Marrow or whoever is like, oh yeah, we'll be on the lookout for stuff like that, and then they burn that O day. Now you've
Yep.
got like potentially four parties involved trying to make sure that this is not being found. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's a neat one. I'm filing this one away in my pocket full of legal scenarios that would be interesting to tabletop exercise with the security team.
uh, so okay, so that's an interesting question too, the tabletops. You're a legal person. When I did legal or IR tabletops at the other company I mentioned with you, we quickly had legal involved
Yep.
in that respect, and only because of the place I worked at was having to deal with the fuzzy bears and the vehement pandas and what have yous, if
Right.
you will. um, During an incident response like that, what for you, what do you like to see from a company in regards to that? Because a lot of your legal response also would kind of dovetail into potentially PR
Yep.
and notifying customers kind of stuff, like we want to frame this wording or this statement just so that we're not either opening ourselves up to litigation or
Yep.
you're not necessarily legal, you're also risk reduction, if you will, right?
Yeah, I mean, much like security in incident response, legal ends up wearing a few different hats, and maybe one of them is a bit larger or heavier than the others. But yeah, I mean, I think you are often a key collaborative point on what's the business risk, what's the financial risk,
Mm-hmm.
what's the PR risk, and I've been involved in a lot of incident response processes as legal,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I think the best elements of that interaction are, I think ideally legal is both there to, as quickly as possible, sort of analyze and answer the core legal questions around a security incident, such
Right.
as, was customer data affected and accessed, and if so, do we need to legally consider this a breach? Do we need to, does this touch any relevant data privacy regulations that require us to disclose it either to an attorney general's office or to the users or to both, or just kind of to play ringleader on the legal analysis of the type of security incident that's occurred and determine if there's sort of specific follow-up steps. But I think also, to be kind of a collaborative voice and a perspective, and also sort of a load lightener for security, to go to PR, to go to the business team, or to go to management and say, hey, here's more or less what we're seeing. Here's a short summary of the relevant information for you. What should we do? Or is there someone on your end that we should loop in? And,
right.
I think I've been in the places I've worked or the clients I've had, I've been quite lucky in that I've gotten to work with great security teams who sort of understand that it's not just, someone scrolling through logs. It's also someone, knowing when to sort of ring the alarm bell and pull in more of the company. And,
Right.
I think there's also, I don't know, most of the security people I've worked with have a very good sense of, at least in broad strokes, what sorts of things legal needs to know about sort of as soon as possible. And having, I think just having a good relationship between the legal and the security and the incident security team is really key, because, on one hand, you as legal, like, I don't ever want to slow down response to an incident, but I also want to be, looped in and aware, and sort of, I want to have the information feed that me and my legal team need to, sort of run back up on those potentially big risk questions of, do we need to report this? If so, how? Just all, all that rundown. And, I think in some ways, especially for the post-incident cleanup stages, it can be a real boon for actually getting stuff fixed too, because I think legal is often in a very good position to say to sort of the upper management team, hey, here's why this one gets high priority for, budgeting or outside help for remediating.
Right.
We sort of get.
Yeah. Or, after, during the lessons learned for the incident response, you may take a look at contracts and realize, well, what we signed with that company or with that group doesn't really protect us in the long run. So we need to, renegotiate that contract, or, the relationship we have with them is fairly poisonous. So we should probably look at, alternatives to fixing that. In my experience in my career, I've often not used legal, but I've often referred to legal when things, they're almost like the third party pen tests that come in. It's like, okay, I'm telling management, I'm telling my upper, level folks, hey, we need to fix this. And then we bring in the third party and they say, hey, you need to fix this. And management's like, oh yes, we need to fix that immediately. I've often used legal as hey, this represents a business risk and nobody's answering. And then I go, hey, legal person, we're doing X. And then legal's like, oh, no, we don't. No, we're not doing that anymore. And, then people listen. So, yeah.
No, I've seen a few examples of that with, I think one of the very common examples is, some vendor program or service that keeps being the source of security incidents. It can be that legal voice that puts it just over the edge to actually get budget to replace them. But any number of situations where having, I think there's, I think both legal and security have a lot of unhelpful stereotypes with certain other parts of the business team, where, just one asking for something can, depending on what the thing is, security is making noise about this again, or legal's complaining about this contract. But if both are speaking at once, and making the same point, I've also seen that generally get pretty good results from sort of the decision-making pieces of a company.
Fantastic. All right. I don't have much of anything else. Do you have any last thoughts before we go?
Oh, let's see. I think the only other thought I'd sort of put as sort of cap on this discussion is one that we touched on before, which is, I think it's really easy for companies to sort of focus on the vulnerability disclosure process and the bug bounty program and these pieces of it. And, sort of that reality of the tough judgment call about, whether that's really better spent as resource on those programs or just on bulking up your security team and sort of doing the fundamentals better is a really tough call. And, I think one of the big takeaways for, especially anyone in sort of that small to medium stage company world of things, it's, I think it's important to make that call carefully, because, at the end of the day, what your disclosure program is an open door to people to come and say, hey, we want to help you out. And, you need both the internal processes to actually take that help, and you need to know that that's actually going to be better for you than just bringing in more people to help full time.
Awesome. All right. Well, Fred, thank you so much for coming on. I know that I when I ask this question, it's not so that they can ask you legal advice, but if people wanted to discuss with you some of this, and maybe hit you up on Twitter, about what responsible disclosure means to you, how would they do so?
Yeah, sure. What I'll do is I'll drop you a link to both the bug bounty program that I put together, as well as my contact info so you can toss those in the show notes. But probably the easiest way to toss me just sort of a casual contact is probably Twitter. It's Esquiring on there.
Okay. Very cool. All right. Excellent. So I do appreciate you taking the time on a Saturday morning here or now Saturday afternoon for you. But I appreciate you coming on and joining me to discuss
of course. Thanks so much for having me on. It was a bunch of really interesting questions.